My granddaughter Mia came bursting through my front door on a Wednesday afternoon, backpack still on, waving a printed assignment sheet in front of my face before I'd even gotten a proper hello out of her. "Grandpa, my teacher wants me to write about a real rescue mission, and Dad said I should ask you if you know anyone who was ever in one," she said, completely unaware that she was asking the one person in her life who actually knew everything about it firsthand. My name is Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes, United States Coast Guard, retired. I was 70 years old, standing in my own kitchen that Wednesday, being asked by my own granddaughter whether I knew anyone who'd been part of a real rescue mission, and I realized in that moment just how completely and quietly I'd disappeared from my own family's understanding of who I actually was. I need to explain how a man ends up this invisible to his own grandchildren, because it happens slowly, over years, without any single dramatic decision behind it. I spent 26 years in the Coast Guard, the majority of it in search and rescue operations along a particularly dangerous stretch of coastline known for sudden, violent weather changes that could turn a routine call into a life-or-death operation within minutes. I participated in hundreds of rescue missions across those years, some routine, many genuinely dangerous, a handful that still visit me in dreams decades later. Images and sounds I've never fully found the words to describe to anyone outside the small circle of people who were actually there with me.
The work required a particular kind of steadiness under pressure, the ability to make split-second decisions in conditions where a single miscalculation could cost someone their life, whether that was a stranger we were trying to save or a member of my own crew. I trained for years to develop that steadiness, and I carried it with me long after retirement, though by then it had transformed into something closer to a quiet, watchful calm that most people who met me simply interpreted as a naturally reserved personality, never guessing at the specific discipline underneath it. I retired 16 years ago, well before Mia or her younger brother Tommy were even born, which meant that from the very beginning of their lives, I existed to them exclusively as Grandpa, a mild, quiet man who showed up for birthdays and holidays, who preferred fishing to conversation, who never once in either of their lifetimes mentioned the specific nature of the career that had occupied the majority of my adult working life. My own children, Mia's father David and his sister Rachel, grew up during my active years, which meant they had at least some general awareness of what I did, having lived through the reality of a father who sometimes disappeared for dangerous operations during severe weather, who occasionally came home exhausted in ways that even as children they understood meant something significant had happened, even without full details. But even they, I've come to realize, never fully understood the specifics, absorbing a general sense of Dad does dangerous rescue work without ever hearing the particular stories that would have given that phrase real weight and texture. By the time Mia and Tommy came along, whatever thin awareness David and Rachel had once carried had faded even further in translation, becoming, by the time it reached my grandchildren, essentially nothing more specific than Grandpa used to be in the Coast Guard, a fact roughly as significant to them in their daily understanding of me as knowing I preferred coffee over tea.
I want to be honest that some part of this suited me, at least for a long time. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from being simply Grandpa, rather than a walking repository of difficult memories that people feel obligated to carefully navigate around. Some of what I witnessed during those 26 years isn't easy to discuss, and I'd made peace, over the years, with the idea that my grandchildren would simply know me as a gentle, quiet old man, without ever needing to understand the specific weight of what that quietness sometimes carried underneath it. Mia's assignment, as she explained it to me that Wednesday, standing in my kitchen with her backpack still on, was part of a broader unit her fifth-grade class was doing on emergency services and community heroes, and her teacher had asked each student to interview someone connected to a real rescue operation, however they could manage to find one: a parent, a neighbor, a family friend. Mia had apparently spent the walk home trying to think of anyone she might know, coming up mostly empty, until her father, overhearing her frustration, had simply said, almost offhandedly, "Ask your grandfather. He did that kind of thing for years." A suggestion Mia had apparently found somewhat surprising, having genuinely never considered that her own grandfather might qualify as someone connected to real rescue missions in any meaningful sense. I want to describe what it felt like, standing in my kitchen, watching my granddaughter's face as she asked the question, genuinely uncertain whether I'd actually have anything useful to offer her, clearly expecting, at best, some vague second-hand knowledge rather than direct first-hand experience. There was a particular kind of quiet sadness in that moment, realizing how completely my own grandchildren had absorbed a version of me that left out something so significant.
I told her, carefully, that yes, I had actually been part of quite a few rescue missions myself, more than I could easily count, and watched her expression shift from mild hopefulness into something closer to genuine shock, the specific look of a child recalibrating an entire category of understanding about someone she thought she already knew completely. She asked, somewhat breathlessly, whether I'd be willing to actually talk about one for her assignment, and I found myself, for reasons I'm still working through even now, saying yes almost immediately, without the usual instinct toward deflection that had governed my relationship with this subject for over a decade. I chose, for that first conversation with Mia, a mission from relatively early in my career, one that had ended successfully, involving a family whose small boat had capsized during a sudden storm off the coast. 3 people, including a child close to Mia's own age at the time, all of whom we managed to recover safely, despite conditions that had made the operation itself genuinely dangerous for my own crew. I want to be honest that even choosing this particular story required some careful editing on my part, appropriate for a 10-year-old's understanding, keeping some of the more frightening operational details vague while still conveying enough of the real difficulty and danger involved that Mia would understand this wasn't simply a routine, easy day at work. Mia sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, asking questions with a seriousness and specificity that surprised me, wanting to know exactly what the weather had been like, exactly what I'd been thinking during the most dangerous moments, whether I'd been scared, how we'd actually managed to get the family out of the water safely. I found myself answering more fully and more honestly than I'd expected to, drawn along by her genuine curiosity in a way that felt entirely different from the vague, obligatory questions adults sometimes ask veterans out of polite social duty.
By the time we finished, nearly 2 hours later, Mia had filled several pages of her notebook, and I'd told her more about that single mission than I'd told my own children about my entire career combined. A realization that struck me with some force once she'd finally packed up her things and headed home to write her report. The assignment itself, when Mia presented it to her class the following week, apparently generated more interest and follow-up questions from her classmates and teacher than any other student's report, given the specificity and genuine drama of the actual events involved. Her teacher, impressed, sent a note home suggesting that I might be willing to come speak to the class directly, an invitation that arrived through David a few days later, framed almost apologetically, as though he wasn't entirely sure how I'd feel about the request. I said yes to that too, somewhat to my own surprise, and spent an afternoon a few weeks later sitting in front of 22 fifth graders, answering their questions, showing them a few old photographs I dug out from a box I hadn't opened in years, watching their genuine fascination with a career I'd spent over a decade treating as something better left unexamined by my own family. The questions from Mia's classmates ranged from the practical to the delightfully unexpected. Whether the boats ever sank, what the scariest moment of my entire career had been, whether I'd ever been genuinely afraid I wouldn't make it back. I answered as many as I could, calibrating each response for a room full of 10-year-olds while still trying to honor the actual weight and seriousness of what I was describing. One boy near the front asked if I still had nightmares, a question that caught me off guard with its directness, and I told him honestly that yes, sometimes I did, which seemed to satisfy the room more than any of my more polished answers had.
David came to pick me up after that classroom visit, and I watched something shift in his own expression as Mia excitedly recounted, in the car, various details from my presentation that he himself, it became clear, had never fully known either, despite having grown up watching me leave for dangerous operations throughout his own childhood. We had a longer conversation that evening, David and I, once Mia had gone to bed, still excited about her successful report. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd never really pushed for more details over the years, partly out of respect for what he'd always sensed was difficult territory for me, partly, he admitted, out of his own unexamined assumption that I simply preferred not discussing it. An assumption, he realized, watching my afternoon with Mia's class, might have been more about his own discomfort than mine. He told me, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, where Mia had interviewed me weeks earlier, that he remembered, as a boy, waiting up some nights when I was called out during particularly bad weather, watching his mother's face for any sign of what might be happening, absorbing an atmosphere of serious tension without ever fully understanding its source. He said that fear, never quite named or explained to him as a child, had somehow calcified into a kind of unspoken family rule that we simply didn't discuss those years directly, a rule neither of us had ever consciously agreed to, but had both somehow maintained for decades. I told him honestly that both things had probably been true at different points over the years, that there had been long stretches where I genuinely didn't have the language or the emotional bandwidth to discuss those memories in detail, but that somewhere along the way that necessary reticence had calcified into a habit that had simply outlasted its original purpose, becoming less about protecting myself and more about a comfortable, unexamined silence that neither of us had ever quite gotten around to questioning.
Since that classroom visit, something has genuinely shifted in how my grandchildren understand me. Mia asks questions regularly now, not overwhelming ones, just the natural curiosity of a child who finally understands there's considerably more to her quiet grandfather than fishing trips and holiday visits. Tommy, a few years younger, has started asking too, mostly wanting to know if I ever saved anyone from sharks. Questions I answer as honestly as his age allows, grateful, in a way I hadn't expected to be, for the simple, uncomplicated curiosity of children finally given permission to actually ask. Mia even asked a few weeks ago if she could interview me again for a school project the following year, already planning ahead for a story she now understands is genuinely worth telling. If you've ever let your own quiet reticence become the entire, incomplete story your grandchildren know about you, I hope you hear this. Being gentle and being invisible aren't actually the same thing, even though they can look identical from a certain angle. Sometimes it takes something as simple as a school assignment, a teacher's ordinary request for a real story, to finally open a door that years of comfortable silence never quite managed to open on its own.